The morning sun barely touched the concrete sidewalks when Dorothy pushed her small shopping cart down Fifth Street. Her gray hair was tucked under a faded blue headscarf, and her brown coat had seen better days. At 96 years old, she moved slowly but with purpose. Like someone who had learned to make every step count, most people walking past her didn't look twice. They were busy checking their phones, rushing to work, or thinking about their own problems. To them, Dorothy was just another elderly person on the street. They couldn't see past the worn clothes and the tired eyes. They didn't know that behind those weathered hands was a story that would make their hearts skip a beat. Dorothy had been living on the streets for almost 3 years now. It wasn't something she ever imagined would happen to her. 3 years ago, she had a small apartment on the east side of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was home. She had her favorite chair by the window, a little kitchen where she made her morning tea, and most importantly, she had her old piano. That piano meant everything to her. It was an old upright that her late husband had bought for her 40 years ago. The keys were yellowed with age, and some of them stuck when you pressed them, but Dorothy loved it anyway. Every morning she would sit down and play for an hour before starting her day. The music would fill her tiny apartment, making it feel like the grandest concert hall in the world. But life has a way of changing everything in the blink of an eye. When the building was sold to new owners, the rent went up so high that Dorothy couldn't afford it anymore. Her small Social Security check wasn't enough to cover the new amount. She tried talking to the landlord, explaining her situation, but business is business, they said. She had 30 days to find somewhere else to live. Dorothy spent those 30 days looking for another place she could afford. She called every number in the newspaper, visited every apartment complex in her price range. But everywhere she went, the answer was the same. The rent was too high, or they wanted deposits she didn't have, or they simply weren't interested in renting to someone her age. On her last day in the apartment, Dorothy sat at her piano one final time. She played all her favorite songs, letting her fingers dance across the keys like they had done thousands of times before. When she finished, she closed the piano lid and put her hand on top of it, saying goodbye to her oldest friend. The new owners had made it clear that the piano couldn't come with her. Where she was going, there would be no room for music. The first night on the street was the hardest. Dorothy had never felt so alone in her entire life. She found a spot behind a grocery store where there was some protection from the wind. She pulled her coat tight around her and tried to sleep, but every sound made her jump. Cars driving by, cats knocking over trash cans, the distant sound of sirens. This was a world she had never known existed, even though it was happening right outside her old apartment window every night. As weeks turned into months, Dorothy learned the unwritten rules of street life. She discovered which places were safe to rest and which ones to avoid. She found out when the soup kitchen opened and where she could get a hot meal. She learned that some people would look right through her, while others would go out of their way to avoid walking near her. The hardest part wasn't the cold nights or the empty stomach. It was becoming invisible. People who might have said hello to her when she was just another elderly lady in the grocery store now acted like she didn't exist. Sometimes children would stare at her with curious eyes until their parents pulled them away and whispered something about not looking at people like that. Dorothy had always been proud of her appearance. Even when money was tight, she made sure her clothes were clean and her hair was neat. But living on the street made that almost impossible. Public restrooms became her dressing room, and keeping clean was a daily challenge. She did her best, but she knew she looked different now. She could see it in the way people's eyes would dart away when they accidentally made eye contact with her. What people didn't know was that Dorothy's mind was still sharp as ever. She remembered every song she had ever learned, every melody that had ever touched her heart. While she pushed her cart down the busy streets, she would hum quietly to herself. Sometimes it was a hymn her mother used to sing, sometimes it was a jazz tune from her younger days. The music in her head was the one thing that couldn't be taken away from her on particularly difficult days, when the loneliness felt too heavy to carry. Dorothy would find a quiet spot and let her fingers move in the air as if she were playing an invisible piano. Her muscle memory was still perfect. She could feel every note, hear every chord, even without an instrument. Passers-by might have thought she was confused or talking to herself, but Dorothy was playing symphonies in her mind. She often thought about her old life and wondered how things had gone so wrong so quickly. She had worked hard her whole life, raised children, paid her taxes, and followed all the rules society laid out for her. Yet here she was, carrying everything she owned in a shopping cart, hoping each day would be a little easier than the last. But Dorothy wasn't bitter. She had learned long ago that anger only makes heavy burdens heavier. Instead, she chose to notice the small kindnesses that still existed in the world. The store clerk who let her use the restroom without buying anything. The young mother who gave her son's uneaten sandwich to Dorothy instead of throwing it away. The elderly man who always nodded and said good morning when he saw her on his daily walk. These tiny moments of human connection kept Dorothy's spirit alive. They reminded her that underneath all the rushing and the business of city life, people still had hearts. They still cared about each other, even if they didn't always know how to show it. As Dorothy made her way down the street that morning, she didn't know that her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. She didn't know that in just a few hours she would discover something that would bring music back into her world. She was just focused on making it through another day, one step at a time, carrying her invisible songs and unshakable hope in her heart. The city woke up around her, full of noise and movement and energy. But Dorothy moved through it all like a quiet melody, almost unheard but somehow essential to the greater symphony of human life. She was about to learn that sometimes the most beautiful music comes from the most unexpected places, and that it's never too late for a song to find its way back home. The wind that Tuesday morning was colder than usual, and Dorothy could feel it cutting right through her thin coat. She had spent the night in a doorway 3 blocks away, but the concrete had stolen all the warmth from her bones. Her arthritis was acting up again, making every step feel like walking on broken glass. She needed somewhere warm, and she needed it soon. Dorothy had heard other people on the street talking about a community center nearby. They said it was one of the good places where the staff treated everyone with respect and didn't make you feel ashamed for needing help. She had been thinking about checking it out for weeks, but something always held her back. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was fear of being turned away. But today, with the cold biting at her face and her fingers going numb, she didn't have much choice. The building was bigger than she expected. It was made of red brick with large windows that let warm yellow light spill out onto the sidewalk. Above the main entrance, a simple sign read, "Riverside Community Center, everyone welcome." Dorothy stood outside for a few minutes, watching people come and go. She saw elderly folks heading in with their walking canes, young mothers with strollers, teenagers with backpacks. It really did seem like a place for everyone. Taking a deep breath, Dorothy pushed her cart to the side of the building where she had seen other people leave their belongings. She made sure it was locked and tucked away safely before walking up the front steps. Her heart was beating faster than it should have been. It had been so long since she had been inside anywhere that wasn't a store or a public bathroom. The moment Dorothy stepped through the front doors, she felt the wonderful sensation of warm air wrapping around her like a soft blanket. The lobby was busy but not chaotic. There were comfortable chairs arranged in small groups, a reception desk where a friendly-looking woman was helping someone fill out paperwork, and bulletin boards covered with colorful announcements for different activities and services. Nobody stared at her. Nobody whispered or pointed or made her feel like she didn't belong. A few people nodded politely as they walked by, and one elderly gentleman even said good morning. Dorothy felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. Maybe this place really was different. She found an empty chair near a large window and sat down carefully, letting the warmth seep into her aching joints. From where she sat, she could see into a large room where a group of seniors were doing some kind of gentle exercise class. In another room, she could hear children laughing and playing. The whole place had a feeling of life and community that Dorothy hadn't experienced in a very long time. As she sat there, grateful just to be warm and safe for a little while, Dorothy's eyes began to wander around the lobby. That's when she saw it, sitting in the far corner like a forgotten friend. An old upright piano, its dark wood surface covered with a thin layer of dust. A few books were stacked on top of it, and someone had hung a coat on the side like it was just another piece of furniture. Dorothy's breath caught in her throat. She blinked several times, thinking maybe she was seeing things. But no, it was definitely a piano. Not a fancy grand piano like the ones in concert halls, but a real piano nonetheless. Her heart started racing, but this time it wasn't from nervousness. She tried to look away, tried to focus on the warmth and the safety she had found in this place. But her eyes kept drifting back to that piano. Even from across the room, she could see that some of the keys were chipped and yellowed with age. One of the legs looked a little wobbly, and she could tell it probably needed tuning. But to Dorothy, it was the most beautiful thing she had seen in 3 years. Memories came flooding back without warning. She remembered the first time she had touched piano keys as a little girl, standing on her tiptoes to reach the keyboard in her church. She remembered her mother clapping when she played her first complete song. She remembered her wedding day when her new husband surprised her by arranging for her to play a special song for their guests. Most of all, she remembered her old piano back in her apartment. The way it sounded in the quiet morning hours when the world was still asleep. The way her fingers knew exactly where to go even when her eyes were closed. The way music could take all her worries and transform them into something beautiful. A staff member walked by, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. She noticed Dorothy looking at the piano and stopped to chat. "Beautiful instrument, isn't it?" the woman said. "It's been here for about 10 years now. Someone donated it when they moved away. We used to have people play it more often, but lately it just sits there. I keep meaning to find someone who might want to use it." Dorothy nodded, not trusting herself to speak. Her throat felt tight with emotion. "Do you play?" the woman asked gently. Dorothy hesitated. It had been so long since anyone had asked her that question. So long since she had thought of herself as someone who played piano, but slowly she nodded. "I used to," she whispered. The woman's face lit up. "Well, you're welcome to try it any time. You're here. I'm sure it would love to be played again. Music makes everything better, don't you think?" After the woman walked away, Dorothy sat staring at the piano for what felt like hours. Part of her wanted to walk over right then and there, to sit down and see if her fingers still remembered what to do. But another part of her was terrified. What if she had forgotten how to play? What if her arthritis made it impossible? What if she tried and nothing beautiful came out? The afternoon passed slowly. Dorothy watched people come and go, listened to the sounds of the community center around her. Children's laughter, friendly conversations, the gentle hum of people living their lives together. And always, in the corner of her vision, that piano waited. As the day grew later and fewer people were around, Dorothy finally stood up from her chair. Her legs were stiff from sitting so long, but she made her way slowly across the lobby. With each step, her heart beat a little faster. She could feel the pull of the music that lived inside her, the songs that had been silent for so long. When she reached the piano, Dorothy stood there for a long moment, just looking at it. She could see her reflection in the polished wood, an old woman with tired eyes and weathered hands. But beneath that reflection, she could also see something else. A flicker of the person she used to be, the person who had never really gone away. Dorothy reached out one finger and gently touched middle C. The note rang out clear and true, filling the quiet lobby with sound. It was slightly out of tune, just as she had expected, but it was real. It was music. And for the first time in 3 years, Dorothy smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to her eyes. Tomorrow, she decided, she would come back. And maybe, just maybe, she would find the courage to sit down and remember who she really was. Dorothy returned to the community center the next morning, but this time her steps were slower, more uncertain. All night long, she had thought about that piano sitting in the corner, calling to her like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. She had barely slept, her mind filled with melodies and memories that wouldn't leave her alone. But now, standing outside the building again, Doubt crept in like morning fog dawed. What if she had imagined how good it felt to touch that single key? What if her fingers had forgotten everything they once knew? What if people stared at her, wondering what a homeless woman was doing trying to play piano? The question swirled in her head as she pushed through the front doors. But the warmth of the lobby welcomed her back just like before. The piano was still there, exactly where she had left it yesterday. Someone had removed the coat that was hanging on its side, and the books that were stacked on top had been moved to a nearby table. It looked lonely sitting there, like it was waiting for something to happen. Dorothy chose the same chair she had sat in yesterday, close enough to see the piano, but far enough away to feel safe. She watched the morning activity around her. Staff members greeting people with genuine smiles. Volunteers helping elderly folks sign up for different programs. Children running excitedly toward their activities. The whole place buzzed with life and purpose. For the first hour, Dorothy just sat and observed. She noticed how comfortable everyone seemed, how they belonged here in a way she hadn't belonged anywhere for a very long time. A group of women about her age were discussing a book they had all read, their laughter filling the air when someone made a funny comment. Near the reception desk, a man was getting help filling out some paperwork, and the staff member was being incredibly patient, explaining each section carefully, but Dorothy's eyes kept drifting back to the piano. From where she sat, she could see that some of the keys were more worn than others, probably the ones that got played most often. The middle section looked like it had seen the most use, which made sense. That's where most simple melodies lived? Where beginners usually started learning, around 10 o'clock? The lobby started to empty out as people headed to their various activities. This was the moment Dorothy had been both hoping for and dreading. With fewer people around, she might have the courage to approach the piano. But it also meant that if she did try to play and it sounded terrible, there would be no noise to cover up her mistakes. She stood up slowly, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. Each step toward the piano felt like walking through thick mud. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she tried to steady them by clasping them together. When she finally reached the piano bench, she stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at the keyboard. The keys looked back at her, black and white soldiers lined up in perfect order, waiting for commands they hadn't received in far too long. Dorothy could see tiny scratches and marks on some of them, evidence of all the hands that had touched them over the years. Children learning their first scales, maybe teenagers practicing for school recitals, perhaps other elderly. People like herself trying to remember songs from their youth. Very carefully, Dorothy sat down on the bench. It was the right height and surprisingly comfortable. She placed her hands in her lap and took a deep breath. The last time she had sat at a piano was 3 years ago, on that final morning in her apartment. The memory was so clear she could almost smell the coffee she had been drinking while she played. Dorothy lifted her right hand and let it hover over the keys. Her fingers were more gnarled now than they had been 3 years ago, her knuckles swollen from arthritis and cold nights on the street. She wondered if they would still remember how to find their way around the keyboard. If the muscle memory that had been built up over decades of playing was still there, she pressed down on middle C, the same key she had touched yesterday. The note rang out clear and true, just like before. Encouraged, she tried the note next to it, then the one after that. Each key responded to her touch, creating sounds that seemed impossibly beautiful after so much silence. Dorothy's left hand joined her right, and she began to play a simple scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. See, the notes flowed from her fingers like water, natural and effortless. It was like riding a bicycle, she realized. Her body remembered what to do, even when her mind was full of doubt, but playing scales was one thing. Playing actual music was something else entirely. Dorothy paused, her hands resting on the keys, trying to decide what song to attempt first. Should she try something simple, a children's song or a basic hymn? Or should she be brave and try one of the pieces that used to be her favorites? She decided to start small. Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star had been the first song she ever learned to play with both hands. It was simple enough that, Even if her fingers were rusty, she should be able to manage it. Dorothy positioned her hands and began to play. The melody came out slowly at first, her fingers searching for the right keys like they were greeting old friends they hadn't seen in years. But as she continued, the song began to flow more smoothly. The notes weren't perfect, and her timing was a little off in places, but it was definitely music. Real, actual music coming from her hands and filling the air around her when she finished. The simple song, Dorothy felt tears starting to form in her eyes. She hadn't realized how much she had missed this, how empty her world had felt without music in it. Playing piano wasn't just something she used to do, it was part of who she was. And sitting here now, with her fingers on the keys again, she felt like she was remembering herself. A soft clapping sound made Dorothy look up. Near the reception desk, the staff member who had spoken to her yesterday was applauding gently, a warm smile on her face. She gave Dorothy a thumbs up before returning to her work, not making a big fuss but letting her know that what she had just done was appreciated. Encouraged by this small show of support, Dorothy tried another song. This time she chose Amazing Grace, a hymn she had played countless times in her life. Her fingers found the melody almost automatically, and soon the beautiful, familiar tune was floating through the lobby. This song was more complex than the first one, with deeper bass notes and a more intricate harmony, but Dorothy's hands remembered every part of it as she played. She noticed that a few people had stopped what they were doing to listen. An elderly man reading a newspaper had lowered it slightly, his head tilted toward the music. Two women who had been chatting quietly had paused their conversation, their faces peaceful as they listened to the hymn. Even some of the staff members had slowed down their work, letting the music wash over them. Dorothy finished the song and sat quietly for a moment, her hands still resting on the keys. For the first time in 3 years, she felt like herself again. Not the homeless woman with the shopping cart, not the invisible person that everyone looked through, but Dorothy the pianist, Dorothy the musician, Dorothy the woman who could take black and white keys and turn them into something that touched people's hearts. She played one more song before standing up, a gentle lullaby her mother used to sing to her when she was very small. As the last notes faded away, Dorothy carefully closed the piano lid and smoothed her hand across its surface, the same way she used to do with her old piano back home. Tomorrow, she decided, she would come back and play again. Word traveled fast in the community center. By Thursday morning, when Dorothy arrived for her 3rd day of piano playing, she noticed something different. The usual morning crowd was there, but there seemed to be an extra energy in the air, like everyone was expecting something special to happen. Dorothy had spent Wednesday playing for almost 2 hours, working her way through songs she hadn't touched in years. Her fingers were getting stronger, more confident with each passing day. The rust was coming off and the music was flowing more naturally. But she had no idea that people were talking about her performances, sharing stories about the mysterious woman who could make magic happen with those old piano keys. She settled into her routine, taking her usual seat for a few minutes before approaching the piano. But today, instead of waiting for the lobby to empty out, she noticed that people seemed to be finding reasons to linger. The man who usually read his newspaper by the window had moved to a chair closer to the piano. 2 women who normally headed straight to their morning exercise class were sitting nearby, chatting quietly but clearly in no hurry to leave. Dorothy felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. Yesterday, only a few people had stopped to listen when she played. Today felt different. There was an expectancy in the air that made her hands shake slightly as she approached the piano bench. She sat down and lifted the piano lid, running her fingers gently across the keys before she began to play. She had decided to start with something simple, a gentle melody that wouldn't draw too much attention. But as soon as the first notes of Scarborough Fair began to fill the lobby, she could feel the change in the room. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Footsteps slowed down. Even the staff members behind the reception desk seemed to pause in their work. Dorothy tried to focus only on the music, letting her fingers find their way through the beautiful, haunting melody. But she could sense the growing audience around her, and surprisingly, instead of making her more nervous, it seemed to inspire her to play even better. When she finished the song, there was a moment of perfect silence before gentle applause filled the lobby. Dorothy looked up to see that at least 15 people had gathered around the piano area. Some were sitting in the nearby chairs, others were standing along the walls, and a few children had even stopped their games to listen. An elderly woman with silver hair and kind eyes approached the piano. "That was absolutely beautiful, dear," she said, her voice warm with genuine appreciation. "I haven't heard that song played so beautifully in years. Would you mind playing something else?" Dorothy felt her cheeks warm with pleasure. It had been so long since anyone had complimented her music, so long since she had felt like she had something valuable to offer. "What would you like to hear?" she asked softly. "Oh, anything you'd like to play," the woman replied. "You clearly know what you're doing." Dorothy thought for a moment, then began to play "What a Wonderful World." As the familiar melody began, she heard several people hum along softly. The song seemed to touch something deep in everyone who was listening. By the time she reached the chorus, she could hear quiet voices joining in with the words, creating a gentle choir that filled the lobby with warmth. As the song ended, more people had gathered. Dorothy looked around and realized that nearly 30 people were now listening to her play. There were seniors from the morning programs, parents who had dropped their children off for activities, teenagers who should have been rushing off to school, and staff members who had found excuses to step away from their duties. "Do you know any gospel music?" asked a woman with a beautiful smile. "My grandmother used to play piano at our church, and your style reminds me so much of her." Dorothy's heart leaped. Gospel music had been her specialty for many years. She had played at 3 different churches over the decades, bringing congregations to their feet with her powerful renditions of classic hymns. "I know quite a few," she said, her confidence growing. She began with, "How Great Thou Art," letting her fingers dance across the keys with more energy than she had shown in her previous performances. This was music she knew by heart, music that came from deep in her soul. As she played, she could feel the spiritual power of the song reaching everyone in the room. The response was immediate and powerful. Several people began singing along, their voices blending together in natural harmony. An elderly man who had been sitting quietly in the corner stood up and removed his hat, his face filled with emotion. A young mother holding a baby began swaying gently to the music, and even some of the teenagers seemed moved by the performance. When Dorothy finished the hymn, the applause was louder and more enthusiastic than before. But what touched her most were the faces looking back at her. She saw tears in some eyes, smiles on every face, and something she hadn't seen directed at her in 3 years, respect and admiration. "Ma'am," said a teenager with a backpack slung over his shoulder, "that was incredible. How long have you been playing piano?" Dorothy paused, thinking about how to answer. How could she explain that she had been playing for over 70 years, that music had been her companion through every joy and sorrow of her long life? "A very long time," she said simply. A staff member stepped forward, her face glowing with excitement. "Dorothy, right?" she said, having learned her name over the past few days. "Would you be interested in playing for our afternoon senior group today? They meet at 2 o'clock, and I know they would absolutely love to hear you play." Dorothy felt a surge of something she hadn't experienced in years, the feeling of being wanted, of having something valuable to contribute. I would like that very much," she said. As the morning crowd began to disperse, people didn't just walk away. They stopped to speak with Dorothy, to thank her for the music, to share memories that her songs had brought back. An elderly gentleman told her about his late wife, who used to play piano just like Dorothy did. A middle-aged woman mentioned that the hymn had reminded her of her childhood, sitting in church next to her grandmother, but it was a little girl, maybe 8 years old, who touched Dorothy's heart the most. The child had been sitting on the floor during the last song, completely mesmerized by the music. As her mother prepared to take her to the children's program, the little girl approached the piano. "That was really pretty," she said in a small voice. "Will you play again tomorrow?" Dorothy looked down at the child's earnest face and felt something shift inside her chest. For 3 years, she had felt like she was invisible, like she didn't matter to anyone. But here was this little girl, looking at her with genuine interest and hope. "Yes, sweetheart," Dorothy said, her voice catching slightly. "I'll be here tomorrow." As the lobby returned to its normal morning rhythm, Dorothy remained at the piano for a few more minutes. She played quietly to herself, simple melodies that helped her process what had just happened. In the span of one morning, she had gone from being an invisible homeless woman to being someone that people sought out, someone whose music brought joy and comfort to others. For the first time in 3 years, Dorothy felt like she had found her place in the world again. It wasn't the same place she had before, and her circumstances hadn't changed overnight. But in this corner of the community center, sitting at this old, slightly out-of-tune piano, she was exactly who she was meant to be, and tomorrow she would be back. By the following week, Dorothy had become a regular fixture at the community center. Every morning, people would look for her, and every afternoon, a small crowd would gather around the piano to listen to her play. But despite the growing attention, Dorothy remained a mystery to most people. They knew she could play piano beautifully, they knew she was homeless, but they knew very little about the woman behind the music. That began to change on a rainy Thursday afternoon when Dorothy was playing for the senior group. She had just finished a lovely rendition of Moon River when an elderly man named Frank, who had been coming to the center for 5 years, raised his hand like he was in school. "Dorothy," he said, his voice curious but respectful, "I hope you don't mind me asking, but where did you learn to play like that?" "You don't play like someone who just picked it up as a hobby. You play like well, like a professional." Dorothy's hand stilled on the keys. She had been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. How could she explain her past without sounding like she was looking for pity? How could she tell her story without it seeming too unbelievable? She looked around the room, at the faces watching her expectantly. These people had welcomed her with open hearts and open minds. Maybe it was time to trust them with her truth. "I suppose I was a professional in a way," Dorothy said quietly, her fingers absently playing a soft melody while she spoke. "I started playing when I was 6 years old. My mama cleaned houses for wealthy families, and one of them had a piano. The lady of the house heard me picking out tunes when I was supposed to be helping my mama, and instead of getting angry, she offered to teach me." The room was completely silent except for the gentle music flowing from Dorothy's fingers. Everyone was leaning forward, hungry for more of her story. "By the time I was 12, I was playing at our church every Sunday. By 16, I was playing at 3 different churches around town. The ministers used to say I could make people feel closer to God just by touching those keys." Dorothy smiled at the memory, her eyes looking far away into the past. A woman named Helen, who had been coming to the center longer than anyone, spoke up. "Did you ever perform professionally? Like in concerts or anything?" Dorothy nodded slowly. "I played at weddings, funerals, church revivals, and local events for about 15 years. Nothing fancy, you understand. I wasn't playing at Carnegie Hall or anything like that. But I was making money doing what I loved, and in a small town. That was something special." "What happened?" asked Frank gently. "What made you stop?" Dorothy's melody became slower, more melancholy. "Life happened," she said simply. "I got married when I was 22 to a good man who worked at the factory. We had 5 children together, and when you're raising 5 kids, piano playing becomes something you do when you can find the time, not something you do for a living." She paused her playing entirely now, her hands resting in her lap. "My husband worked double shifts to support us all, and I took any job I could find that worked around the children's schedules. I cleaned offices at night, did laundry for other families, watched neighbors' kids. The piano became my escape, my sanctuary. After long days and longer nights, I would sit down and play, and for a little while I could remember who I used to be." The seniors in the room nodded knowingly. Many of them understood what it meant to set aside dreams for family, to sacrifice personal desires for the greater good. "I kept playing at church whenever I could," Dorothy continued. "Sunday mornings were mine. No matter how tired I was, no matter what else was happening in our lives, I was there every Sunday, playing for the congregation. Some of my happiest memories are of those Sunday mornings, feeling the music lift everyone's spirits, including my own. A younger woman who worked at the center and had been listening from the doorway asked, "Did your children inherit your musical talent?" Dorothy's face lit up with pride. "3 of them did. My youngest daughter, Patricia, became quite an accomplished singer. She performed in school musicals and church choirs until she moved away for college. My son Robert learned to play guitar and used to accompany me sometimes when we played together at family gatherings. And my oldest, Michael, he had a beautiful voice. He could have been a singer if he had wanted to." "Do you still keep in touch with them?" Helen asked gently. Dorothy's expression grew more complex, a mixture of love and sadness crossing her face. "They're all scattered now, living their own lives in different states. Patricia is in California with her family, Robert is in Texas, Michael is somewhere up north. We lost touch gradually over the years, especially after their father passed away. You know how it is, life gets busy, people move on, and before you know it, years have gone by." The room was quiet for a moment, everyone processing this information. Finally, Frank asked the question that everyone was wondering about. "How did you end up? How did things change for you?" Dorothy took a deep breath. This was the hardest part of her story to tell. "After my husband died 8 years ago, I managed on my own for a while. I had our little apartment, and I had my old piano that he had bought for me when we were young. I thought I would be okay. But then the building got sold, and the new owners raised the rent so high that my Social Security couldn't cover it." She started playing again, a slow, sad melody that seemed to echo the pain in her words. "I tried everything. I applied for assistance programs, looked for cheaper places to live, even tried to find work despite my age. But nothing worked out. I had 30 days to leave the apartment, and on the last day I had to say goodbye to my piano. I couldn't take it with me because I didn't have anywhere to take it to. That must have been heartbreaking," Helen whispered. "It was like losing a family member," Dorothy admitted. "That piano had been with me through my children's childhoods, through my husband's illness, through every joy and sorrow of my adult life. Leaving it behind felt like leaving part of my soul behind." An older gentleman named Walter, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "But you never lost the music, did you? Even living on the streets, you kept the music inside you." Dorothy smiled through the tears that had started to form in her eyes. "Music isn't something you can lose even when you lose everything else. Every night, lying wherever I could find shelter, I would play songs in my mind. I would move my fingers, like I was playing an invisible piano, remembering every note, every chord. The music was the one thing that couldn't be taken away from me." Frank stood up slowly and began to applaud. "Dorothy, thank you for sharing your story with us. You've been through so much, but you never gave up on your gift." Soon the entire room was applauding, not just for her music this time, but for her strength, her resilience, and her willingness to trust them with her truth. Dorothy looked around at all these faces that had become familiar and dear to her over the past few weeks, and she realized something wonderful had happened. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't just the homeless woman with the shopping cart. She was Dorothy the pianist, Dorothy the mother, Dorothy the survivor. She was a person with a history, with talents, with a story worth telling. And for the first time in 3 years, she felt like she truly belonged somewhere. 2 weeks after Dorothy had shared her story with the senior group, something unexpected happened that would change her life forever. It started on a busy Friday afternoon when the community center was buzzing with more activity than usual. The children's after-school program was in full swing. Parents were picking up their kids, and the lobby was filled with the cheerful noise of families reuniting after a long day. Dorothy was at her usual spot by the piano, playing softly while people came and went. She had grown comfortable with the constant activity around her, and she loved how her music seemed to add a peaceful soundtrack to the everyday chaos of community life. Today she was playing one of her favorite classical pieces, Chopin's Minute Waltz, a song that never failed to make her feel elegant and graceful. Despite her circumstances. Near the reception desk, A young woman named Katie was volunteering. For the first time. She was a college student who had signed up to help with the after-school program, but she had arrived early and was waiting for her supervisor to give her instructions. As she sat waiting, she became completely captivated by the music coming from the piano. Katie had studied music in high school and knew enough about piano to recognize that what she was hearing was exceptional. This wasn't just someone playing a pretty tune. This was someone with real skill, real training, and real artistry. The way Dorothy's fingers moved across the keys was mesmerizing, and the emotion she put into every note was powerful enough to stop conversations across the room without really thinking about it. Katie pulled out her phone. She wasn't planning to do anything with what she recorded, but the music was so beautiful that she wanted to capture it somehow. She held up her phone and began recording, careful to stay far enough away that she wasn't being intrusive. Dorothy was completely lost in the music, her eyes closed as her fingers danced through the complex melody of the waltz. She had no idea she was being recorded. She was simply doing what came naturally to her, sharing her gift with anyone who wanted to listen. When the song ended, Katie stopped recording and walked over to Dorothy. She had captured almost 3 minutes of the performance, and watching it back on her phone gave her chills all over again. "Excuse me," Katie said politely, approaching the piano bench. "That was absolutely incredible. I hope you don't mind, but I recorded part of your performance. Would it be okay if I shared it online? I think people would really love to hear your music." Dorothy looked up at the young woman, surprised by the request. "Online?" she asked, not entirely sure what that meant. Dorothy had lived most of her life before the internet became a big part of daily life, and she didn't really understand how things worked in the digital world. Katie sat down in a nearby chair and explained gently. "There are websites where people share videos of interesting things they find. When something is really special, like your music, it can be seen by thousands of people all over the world. I think your playing is so beautiful that it deserves to be heard by more people than just those of us here at the center." Dorothy felt a flutter of nervousness in her stomach. The idea of strangers watching her play was both exciting and terrifying. "I don't know," she said hesitantly. "I'm not sure I'm ready for something like that." Katie smiled warmly. "You don't have to decide right now. Think about it over the weekend, and if you're comfortable with it, I could post the video on Monday. I promise I'll only share it if you give me permission." That weekend, Dorothy couldn't stop thinking about Katie's offer. Part of her was scared of what people might say or think. But another part of her, the part that had always loved performing, was curious about the possibility of sharing her music with people beyond the walls of the community center on Monday. Morning, Dorothy found Katie at the reception desk. "I've been thinking about what you said," she told the young woman. "If you really think people would enjoy hearing my music, then yes, you can share that video." Katie's face lit up with excitement. "Really? Oh, Dorothy, I'm so glad. I think you're going to be amazed by how people respond to your playing." That afternoon, Katie uploaded the video to several social media platforms. She wrote a simple caption: "Meet Dorothy, a 96-year-old woman who plays piano at our local community center. Her story is incredible, and her talent is undeniable. Please share this beautiful music with the world." For the first few hours, nothing much happened. The video got a few dozen views from Katie's friends and family members, but then something magical began to occur. People who watched the video were so moved by Dorothy's playing that they shared it with their own friends and family. Those people shared it with their networks, and slowly but surely, the video began to spread. By Tuesday morning, the video had been viewed several thousand times. By Tuesday evening, it had reached 50,000 views. Comments were pouring in from all over the world, with people expressing amazement at Dorothy's skill and sharing their own stories about elderly musicians in their families. Wednesday morning brought a phone call to the community center that no one was expecting. A reporter from the local news station had seen the video online and wanted to come interview Dorothy and film her playing. The center's director was thrilled and immediately called Dorothy to let her know about the opportunity. Dorothy was nervous but excited. She had never been on television before, and the idea seemed both wonderful and terrifying. But when the news crew arrived that afternoon, they treated her with such respect and kindness that her nervousness quickly melted away. The reporter asked Dorothy about her musical background, her current situation, and how it felt to suddenly have people all over the world listening to her music. Dorothy answered honestly and openly, sharing her story with the same grace and dignity she brought to her piano playing. When they asked her to play something for the cameras, Dorothy chose Amazing Grace, the hymn that had always held special meaning for her. As she played, several people in the community center gathered around to listen, creating a beautiful scene of community and appreciation that the cameras captured perfectly. The news story aired that evening, and by Thursday morning, Dorothy's video had exploded across the internet. It had been viewed over 1 million times, and the numbers were climbing every hour. Comments were coming in multiple languages from people in countries Dorothy had never even heard of, but it wasn't just the number of views that was remarkable. It was the quality of the response. People weren't just watching the video and moving on. They were sharing deeply personal stories about their own grandparents, their own experiences with music, and their own beliefs about the value and dignity of every human being. Many comments talked about how Dorothy's story had changed their perspective on homeless people, helping them realize that everyone has a history, talents, and worth that might not be immediately visible. Others shared memories of elderly family members who had similar musical gifts that were often overlooked or forgotten. The video had touched something deep in people's hearts. In a world that often seemed harsh and divided, Dorothy's music reminded everyone of the beauty that exists when we take the time to really see and hear each other. Dorothy herself was overwhelmed by the response. She couldn't believe that her simple piano playing had reached so many people and touched so many hearts. But as she read some of the comments that Katie helped translate for her, she began to understand that her music had become more than entertainment. It had become a bridge connecting people across all kinds of differences, reminding them of their shared humanity. As the video continued to spread around the world, Dorothy realized that her life was about to change in ways she never could have imagined. Within a week of the video going viral, Dorothy's life became something she could never have imagined. The community center's phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, radio stations, and people from all over the country who wanted to help. The staff had to set up a special system just to handle all the attention Dorothy was receiving. The first sign that something extraordinary was happening came on Friday morning when Dorothy arrived at the community center to find a small crowd of people waiting outside. At first, she thought maybe there was some kind of special event happening that she didn't know about. But as she approached the building, several people recognized her from the video and began approaching her with warm smiles and kind words. A middle-aged woman from the next town over had driven 45 minutes just to meet Dorothy in person. "I saw your video online," she explained, tears in her eyes. "Your playing reminded me so much of my grandmother, who passed away last year. She used to play piano at our church, just like you did. Hearing you play brought back all these beautiful memories of sitting next to her on the piano bench when I was little." An elderly gentleman had brought his teenage grandson specifically to meet Dorothy. "I wanted him to understand that talent and wisdom don't disappear just because someone falls on hard times," he explained. "Your music shows that every person has value and something beautiful to offer the world." But it wasn't just the visitors that showed Dorothy how much her story had touched people. Inside the community center, the staff showed her a computer screen filled with messages that had been pouring in from around the world. Katie, the young volunteer who had originally posted the video, had been helping to read and organize all the responses. "Dorothy, you need to see this," Katie said, her voice filled with excitement. "People aren't just watching your video and leaving comments, they're actually doing something about it." Katie showed Dorothy email after email from people who wanted to help. A piano teacher in Oregon had started a fundraising campaign to help Dorothy find permanent housing. A group of church musicians in Georgia had collected money to send her. A family in Michigan had researched local housing programs and sent detailed information about assistance Dorothy might qualify for, but perhaps most touching were the personal gifts that had started arriving at the community center. A woman in Florida had sent a warm winter coat in Dorothy's size, along with a note saying she had a grandmother about Dorothy's age and couldn't bear the thought of her being cold. A family in Ohio had sent a care package filled with practical items like toiletries, socks, and snacks, along with a beautiful card signed by their 3 children. A music store owner in the next state over had driven 6 hours to deliver a gift that made Dorothy cry the moment she saw it. He had brought a portable electronic keyboard, not as fancy as a real piano, but something Dorothy could have with her wherever she stayed. "Every musician needs an instrument," he said simply, "and you, ma'am, are definitely a musician." The outpouring of support wasn't just material. Musicians from all over the country were reaching out, wanting to collaborate with Dorothy or simply to express their admiration for her talent. A jazz pianist from New York City called to tell Dorothy that her video had inspired him to volunteer at his local homeless shelter. A church organist from California sent a package of sheet music, saying she thought Dorothy might enjoy learning some new pieces. One of the most surprising contacts came from a representative of a major piano manufacturer. The company had seen Dorothy's video and wanted to do something special for her. They offered to provide her with a high-quality digital piano that would be hers to keep, along with a sound system that would allow her to perform in larger venues if she wanted to. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from other seniors who had seen Dorothy's story and felt inspired to share their own hidden talents. The community center started receiving calls from elderly people who had given up hobbies years ago but wanted to try them again. A woman who used to paint wanted to know if there were art classes. A man who had played violin in his youth asked about starting a small music group. Dorothy's story had reminded people that age doesn't diminish the value of human creativity and expression. Senior centers across the country reported increased enrollment in their programs, with people specifically mentioning Dorothy's video as their inspiration to get back out into their communities. The financial support was overwhelming. A crowdfunding page that someone had started without Dorothy even knowing about it had raised over $50,000 in just 1 week. People were donating everything from $5 to several $100s, each contribution accompanied by messages of support and encouragement. Local businesses wanted to help too. A nearby restaurant offered to provide Dorothy with free meals whenever she wanted them. A clothing store donated a wardrobe of warm, comfortable clothes in her size. A local bank offered to help her manage the money that was being donated and to assist her in finding permanent housing. But it was the personal connections that meant the most to Dorothy. Children from local schools had made her cards and drawings. One little girl had drawn a picture of Dorothy at the piano with a big smile on her face and the words, "You make beautiful music," written in crayon across the top. A group of teenagers from the high school music program came to visit Dorothy and asked if she would teach them some of the songs she knew. They spent an entire afternoon gathered around the piano while Dorothy shared stories about the pieces she was playing and the history behind the music. Even more surprising were the calls from people who claimed to be Dorothy's relatives. Her story had spread far enough that distant cousins and old family friends who had lost touch with her decades ago were reaching out, trying to reconnect. Some of these connections were genuine, bringing Dorothy news about family members she hadn't heard from in years. One call that particularly moved Dorothy came from a woman who said she was the daughter of one of Dorothy's former piano students from 30 years ago. "My mother always talked about how you taught me to play for Elisa when I was 8 years old," the woman said. "She passed away 5 years ago, but she never forgot how patient and kind you were with me. When I saw your video, I knew I had to call and tell you how much your teaching meant to our family." Local churches had also reached out, inviting Dorothy to play for their services if she was interested. The pastor from a nearby church called to say that his congregation had been so moved by Dorothy's story that they had decided to start a program to help homeless seniors in their community. All of this attention and support was wonderful, but it was also overwhelming for Dorothy. She had gone from being invisible to being the center of more attention than she had ever experienced in her life. The community center staff made sure she had help managing all the responses and that she never felt pressured to accept offers. She wasn't comfortable with Dot as Dorothy sat at the piano that evening. Playing softly while the center closed down around her, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed. Just 2 weeks ago, she had been just another homeless woman that most people looked right through. Now, thousands of people around the world knew her name and her story, but the most amazing thing wasn't the money or the gifts or even the recognition. It was the reminder that music truly was a universal language that could connect hearts across any distance or difference. Her simple decision to sit down at an old piano had created ripples of kindness and generosity that were spreading further than she ever could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities. But tonight, Dorothy felt something she hadn't felt in years, hope for the future. 6 months later, Dorothy sat at a beautiful grand piano in her new apartment, watching the morning sunlight stream through clean windows onto polished hardwood floors. The apartment wasn't large, but it was perfect for her needs. It had a cozy living room where the piano took center stage, a small kitchen where she could make her morning tea, and a comfortable bedroom that stayed warm all winter long. The piano had been a gift from the piano manufacturer who had reached out after her. Video went viral. It was more beautiful than any instrument she had ever owned, with keys that responded perfectly to her touch and a sound so rich and clear that it filled her heart with joy every time she played. But what made it even more special was the small plaque attached to the side that read, "For Dorothy, who reminds us that music never ages." Getting to this point hadn't been easy. The sudden fame and attention had been overwhelming at first, and Dorothy had needed help learning how to manage all the offers of assistance that poured in. The community center had connected her with a social worker who specialized in helping seniors, and together they had carefully sorted through all the options to find the best path forward. The apartment had been made possible by a combination of the money donated by strangers online and a special housing program for seniors that Dorothy hadn't known existed before her story became public. The application process had taken several months, but the wait had been worth it. For the first time in 3 years, Dorothy had a place that was truly hers, where she could lock the door at night and wake up in the same bed every morning. But Dorothy's new beginning wasn't just about having a roof over her head. Her life had taken on a purpose and meaning that surprised everyone, including herself. Word of her musical talent and inspiring story had spread throughout the local community, and she had become something she never expected to be at 96 years old. A performing artist with a regular schedule of appearances, 3 days a week. Dorothy still went to the community center where her journey had begun. She had become an official volunteer there, leading a music program for seniors that had grown from just a few people sitting around the old piano to an organized group of 25 people who met every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. Some of them played instruments, others just sang along, and a few simply came to listen. But all of them had found something valuable in making music together. The program had become so popular that other community centers in nearby towns had asked Dorothy to help them start similar groups. Once a month, she would visit a different center, sharing her story and showing other seniors that it was never too late to reconnect with music or any other passion they might have set aside. Local churches had also embraced Dorothy's return to the musical world. She played at a different church almost every Sunday, rotating between 5 congregations that had all invited her to be part of their worship services. The pastors said that Dorothy's playing brought something special to their services, a depth of feeling that came from someone who had experienced both great joy and deep sorrow in her life. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Dorothy's new life was the unexpected family she had gained. The viral video had not only brought strangers into her life, but had also helped her reconnect with relatives she hadn't spoken to in years. Her daughter Patricia had seen the video while scrolling through social media one evening and had immediately called the community center to get in touch with her mother. The reunion had been emotional for both of them. Patricia lived in California with her husband and two teenage children, and like many adult children, she had gotten caught up in the busyness of her own life and had gradually lost touch with her mother. She had assumed Dorothy was doing fine on her own and hadn't realized how much her circumstances had changed. Patricia had flown out to visit as soon as she learned about her mother's situation, and they had spent a week together rebuilding their relationship. Dorothy's other children had also reached out, and now she had regular phone calls and video chats with grandchildren she hadn't seen in years. The technology for video calling had been another adjustment for Dorothy, but Katie, the young volunteer, who had first posted her video, had taught her how to use a tablet that someone had donated. Now Dorothy could see her family's faces whenever they talked, and she had even played piano for her grandchildren over video calls, watching their amazed expressions as they heard their grandmother's talent for the first time. Dorothy's story had also inspired changes in her community that went far beyond her own situation. The local government had started a new program to identify and assist homeless seniors, recognizing that Dorothy's experience wasn't unique. Several other elderly people had been found living in difficult situations and had been connected with resources they needed. The community center had received so many donations inspired by Dorothy's story that they had been able to expand their program significantly. They had added new activities, extended their hours, and hired additional staff members. Most importantly, they had created a fund to help other people in crisis situations, ensuring that Dorothy's story would continue to help others long into the future. But Dorothy hadn't forgotten where she came from or the people who were still struggling on the streets. Once a week, she visited local shelters and soup kitchens, not to perform, but simply to talk with people who were going through experiences similar to what she had faced. She had become an advocate for homeless seniors, speaking at city council meetings and community events about the need for more affordable housing and better support systems. Her message was always the same: every person has value, every person has a story, and every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect regardless of their circumstances. She would tell audiences that she had been invisible for 3 years, but that didn't mean she had stopped being a person worthy of care and consideration. Dorothy had also started writing her memoirs with the help of a local author who had volunteered to assist her. The book would tell the full story of her life, from her childhood learning piano in wealthy people's homes to her years as a church musician, through raising 5 children and losing her husband, and finally to her experience of homelessness and her unexpected return to the spotlight. The publisher had already expressed interest in the book, saying that Dorothy's story represented something important about resilience, the power of community, and the way that hidden talents could surprise everyone when given the chance to shine. On this particular morning, as Dorothy finished playing her favorite hymn and prepared to start her day, she thought about how dramatically her life had changed. She was no longer the invisible woman pushing a shopping cart down busy streets. She was Dorothy the pianist, Dorothy the advocate, Dorothy the grandmother who had found her way back to her family, but most importantly, she was Dorothy the reminder that every person carries within them gifts and experiences that make them valuable, regardless of what their external circumstances might suggest. At 96 years old, she had learned that it truly was never too late for a new beginning, never too late to find purpose, and never too late to discover that the world still had room for the music that lived in her heart. As she stood up from the piano bench and prepared to head to the community center for another day of making music with friends, Dorothy smiled. She had found her way home, not just to a physical place, but to herself and to the community where she belonged. And tomorrow there would be more music to make and more hearts to touch.